Hello, everyone. Today we'll be responding to Peach's Gay is Unnatural. It was a video that resonated with me, given what they discuss. Speaking of which, we'll be reading their description first, followed by the comment I gave after watching it. And given the length of the video, I thought, well, we may as well respond to it too, given it's only 5 minutes long. All of that being said, if you like what I do, you can like, share, and subscribe. You can leave a comment. There are also donation links in the description of my video. Every bit helps. All of that being said, let's get started. So first off, the description of their video reads, "It's Coley Stevens and a whole lot of ignorance about human anatomy and behavior. Reject bigotry, embrace education and respect, and don't be afraid to try something gay. Hashtag atheist, LGBTQA, queer advocacy, and pride." And the video is basically talking about gay being something natural within the natural world and something that retains its natural qualities throughout modernity or the unnatural / man-made world. And I really like what Peach says to the point that I write. Exactly. Trans academic, activist, and eco-socialist author, sex worker here. Humans are animals, and animals historically fight over territory, cannibalize, enslave, and do various other things under natural scarcity. The big difference with humans, I would add, is manufactured scarcity under capitalism. Likewise, capital is heteronormative, settler colonial, and Cartesian. All social, human devices other animals do not engage with. Nature, by comparison, is largely abject, monstrous-feminine, under capital, i.e. something to map, then pimp out and exploit in predominantly unnatural ways, which Patel and Moore describe as follows in A History of the World in 7 Cheap Things. The inventors of nature were philosophers as well as conquerors and profiteers. The invention of nature and society was gendered at every turn. The binaries of man and woman, nature and society, drank from the same cup. Nature and its boundary with society was gynecological from the outset. Through this radically new mode of organizing life and thought, nature became not a thing, but a strategy that allowed for the ethical and economic cheapening of life. Cartesian dualism was and remains far more than a descriptive statement. It is a normative statement of how to best organize power and hierarchy, humanity and nature, man and woman, colonizer and colonized. Although the credit and blame is shared by many, it makes sense to call this a Cartesian revolution. Here was an intellectual movement that shaped not only ways of thinking, but also ways of conquering, commodifying, and living that made thinking undoable, the colonial project of mapping and domination. The modern map did not merely describe the world, it was a technology of conquest. Unquote. Don't tell this to defenders of modernity, the Enlightenment and capital out of that system, though. For them, largely white straight men, the world is operating exactly as it should, favoring them as more privileged workers within the owner-worker binary. Great video, comrade, and happy Pride. And my point in citing this quote specifically was to basically provide some added context to these quote-unquote scientific attitudes. And when I say quote-unquote, I mean that they belong to a system of thought that isn't entirely without some labeling as scientific, and even through the method of science can be abused in Cartesian ways. Cartesian dualism was tied to the rise of modern science under Francis Bacon to penetrate the womb of nature and torture her secrets out of her in ways that effectively have a in-group versus an out-group. The in-group being white European men and the out-group being basically everyone else. And within that in-group, white European men would have been straight, and they would have seen a natural order as something that they would enforce unnaturally alongside the invention of nature through a given philosophy that conquers and profits off the pimping of nature accordingly. As I put it, nature is monstrous-feminine vis-a-vis Barbara Creed, the Gorgon. There has to be something to police and punish, but also subjugate and bring back into the fold. It's the virgin whore argument. So keeping that in mind, let's watch Peach's video and then respond to it. I'm struggling right now to get through this video and comment on it in a way where I can do it succinctly. So I've tried recording multiple times, and it's usually something where I have to practice multiple times before I can sort of do it in a succinct manner. But simply to address the main statement here, or thrust of the argument, gay is unnatural, not Peach's argument, but the person that they're responding to, specifically this guy, who is responding to this person, and both of whom Peach is responding to, and now I'm responding to them. And the whole point in me even responding at all is to basically point out that any sort of sense of natural versus unnatural stems from Cartesian thought. And Cartesian thought framing things as thinking beings versus extended beings. Thinking beings basically being white, straight European men, first and foremost, which would later extend to tokenized groups, women, followed by gay people and other minorities who could tokenize accordingly. But at the end of the day, the in-group, the center of the group that's benefiting the most a priori from the system on paper that is then executed in nature are white straight guys from Western Europe. And from there, anything that we see here when dealing with bigotry while trying to educate others and be respectful accordingly, when you're dealing with bad actors, you're dealing with Christo-fascists, essentially. You're dealing with people that, by accident of birth, through the systems that they find themselves in, are basically, often through neurotypical people who are less likely to critique dogma, suddenly subject to dogma, which, unnatural, man-made, is something that Mary Shelley might critique in Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus, which unto itself lampooned Cartesian thought through a Byronic parody that would seem to frame science, specifically mad science, as conducive to bad parentage, conducive to poor stewardship of nature while being of nature ourselves. Victor Frankenstein creates a monster that he treats like a monster to exploit, basically nature in small, being pimped by capital in small, workers, owners, thinking beings, extended beings, vis-a-vis Julia Kristeva's abjection process, which is to say the creation of a state of normality by abjecting or throwing off so-called abnormal, unnatural, criminal, monstrous, other into a state of abnormal, and from there can be subject to all manner of persecutory language, from witchcraft accusations to sodomy to blood libel, vampires, werewolves, goblins, witches, and combinations of those different modularities alongside Orientalism as well. And all of these things are modular but can intersect, and they also evolved into themselves. For example, blood libel classically being something out of the medieval period that became after the Enlightenment, during the Enlightenment, after the Enlightenment, which never really went away, into the Protestant ethic, wherein work is holy in ways that through the language of sin dressed up in secular, scientific-sounding language, weaponizes science, mad science, R.E. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, to police anything of nature as unnatural, when the unnatural side effect of that is actually those doing the accusations. It's Darvo and obscurantism. I'm not unnatural, you're unnatural. It's projection that through the abjection process, furthers what I call state predation, or the state, through its various means and models of exploitation, the nuclear model being first and foremost as far as sexual reproduction goes, and is basically what the state relies on to survive, utilizes abjection through Darvo and obscurantism, the stealing of things by raising flags in bad faith, to prey accordingly. Science in this manner is not neutral, but is utilized in bad faith through arguments such as original sin, through persecutory models such as blood libel and sodomy accusations, or otherwise, to prey on nature as extended and under the secular so-called guidance of the state under a Protestant ethic. By virtue of that, moves money through nature to enact capital accordingly. Capital is exploitative by design. It rapes nature and those of it as monstrous-feminine by design, boom or bust. So anything that we could say about the person that Peach is responding to, the bad actor, not the good, is essentially tied to these different tensions, these dialectical material tensions, where the state desires to feed, the state is dead labor feeding on living labor, but is operated by those who are still living technically, but have become dead, have become alien, have become fetishized, diametrically vis-a-vis so-called extended beings, the owner class and those who serve them versus everyone else. So Coley Stevens, the bad actor in this scenario, is a servant of the bourgeoisie, and people such as myself or Peach are on the receiving end of that predation in ways where we have different approaches, where Peach at the end of their video points out that nature has spoken and the superior side of biological reproduction, or diametrically within a mode of pure penetrative sex versus non-penetrative sex, and the spreading of diseases and one's ability to survive sex more broadly, it would seem the female side of that is better adapted. And I have some thoughts and feelings about that, of course. I know they're making a joke in bad faith to castrate the colonizer, which is perfectly valid, though I will point out that despite the ability for those who practice cunnilingus, in particular, non-penetrative sex, generally among women, though penis havers can have penetrative sex as well, though they're not wrong insofar as oral sex often involves teeth. So if you have a penis and you're having oral sex, scratching can occur, penetration into a body cavity with fluids always involves risk, whereas cunnilingus, just using the tongue and saliva on a clitoris, for instance, though it can happen with a penis too, by the way. See, I'm terrible when it comes to receiving jokes and things like that, but I did want to point out that there are going to be pros and cons to that argument, like anything, and I would argue that female bodies within a gender binary that the state enacts are at a disadvantage because they're subject to what they would call wandering womb, hysteria, and various other ways of framing that have all kinds of weird names. Bicycle face, for example, where they believed in the Victorian period that if women rode bicycles, they would get bicycle face and die. Basically, it's stupid. But the point being is that despite any biological advantage that women might have, they are subject to a social disadvantage through Cartesian norms. Man versus woman, as Patel and Moore said. The Gorgon versus Perseus, which ironically was actually given the Aegis from Athena, who then took Medusa's head and put it on the shield, which in the right hands would push back against patriarchal forces, and by extension, under modernity, capital, and a misuse of science accordingly. So just food for thought. This is me as a Gothicist talking about this kinds of stuff. As far as me addressing all of that, I just want to say that everyone is going to have a weak point. And women, despite the fact that they might have that one advantage that Peach points out, are disadvantaged through the state, regardless of biological accuracy or not. But addressing biology have all kinds of stupid horse shit that they have to deal with. So they might have like this one positive thing, but they also have uteruses, which are subject to menstruation, which are subject to polycystic fibrosis and endometriosis and various other conditions, ectopic pregnancies, for instance, which are fatal to the woman. But even if they're not, if they're corrected and caught by surgical means, often lead to a hysterectomy or can lead to a hysterectomy. So there are all kinds of different things where the biology of women, just in a cis kind of way of framing that, is uterus havers more broadly, to make things gender nonconforming, are more volatile, I would argue. Penis havers, prostate havers, what have you, are definitely subject to their own biological factors that they have to keep in mind. They can spread disease just as well because it takes two to tango, though often the whore is blamed or the gay person is blamed more broadly. The queer disease, which would be spread more commonly among cis gay men in particular, being scapegoated as having anal sex, even though there are plenty of cis gay men who don't have anal sex and who don't even have oral sex that involves a sucking on the phallus, for instance. You're negating any sort of risk that that might entail. They would have been scapegoated and framed a particular way. But that doesn't rule out the fact that female bodies more broadly are subject to all manner of biological disadvantages. There's no inherent advantage to having a uterus, insofar as there are plenty of health risks that go into that are just the result of having a uterus, period, regardless if it's being used for sexual reproduction outside of like an ectopic pregnancy or some other pregnancy that goes wrong, and tocophobic fears tied to that within Gothic fiction more broadly. You also have various other things that I mentioned, like endometriosis and polycystic fibrosis, that happen regardless if someone is sexually active or not. Just the fact that they have gone through puberty and their uterus is essentially ready for use, it can still basically malfunction just by virtue of being in the woman's body. And I've been with plenty of people who have had hysterectomies to avoid all of those health problems. But then for women who have had a hysterectomy, they can avoid all of those issues, but they have to go through the procedure, which is relatively non-invasive. Yeah, it's invasive to a point, but they often do minimal incisions. They use lasers and they take it out through those tiny little incisions in pieces, piece by piece. And it's a relatively safe procedure, but getting that procedure is still something that women have to jump through the hoops of the state. And who is gatekeeping that? Men. Men who historically would diagnose women as having hysteria, as having wandering womb. And despite knowing that they have all of these medical risks just by virtue of having a uterus, will basically say, well, you might change your mind at some point. When plenty of uterus havers will be like, no, I am not going to change my mind. I don't want to go on birth control. I just want to get this old uterus out of my body. As my partner Bay Ryan said, uterus. Yeet that fucker into the shadow zone. I get the joke. I just want to ruin it a little bit while still saying men of reason suck per Cartesian models. And we're on the same side. I'm just having a little bit of fun at the end of the video. One thing in particular that I noticed where they are basically pointing out, well, we're human alongside other animals, is basically what Peach says. And this isn't so much addressing the bad actor in the room, Cooley Stevens, but to her audience, while pointing out that Cooley Stevens is wrong. But at the end of the day, Cooley Stevens is a bad actor, so you can't really have a debate with them. You're not going to change their mind. And I don't think that you're trying to change their mind. You know that they're a bad actor, and I get it. And pointing out that we're belonging to the animal kingdom alongside other animals who may or may not have sex for pleasure. Many animals don't. Cloaca havers, for instance, just do a cloaca kiss, and that's it. Whereas other animals in the animal kingdom often have sex in very harmful ways. Consent generally isn't a part of the equation, is generally a human thing because animals can't consent by virtue of the fact that they mate. Some animals have pleasure, and you could say, well, within their own species, maybe they can consent with each other, but they often rape other animals if they are capable of consenting. And I would not encourage cross species pollination in that event. A human should not have sex with a dolphin, even though it could be argued that dolphins can consent with each other and have sex for pleasure, or bonobos can have sex with each other as a social practice. Doesn't mean that humans and bonobos should start having sex with each other. It doesn't work like that. Humans can consent with other humans, but consent is largely a byproduct of humans and their social sexual activities. Humans, ace people in particular, generally see sex as a handshake comparable to bonobos. And that's, a whole nother conversation. I can link to some stuff that was shown to me by someone who was ace, Dr. Sam Hurst, who sent me these things. And then I wrote my own book chapter about sexuality as a sex worker myself, working with other sex workers. Most sex workers that I know tend to be ace on a spectrum where ace just means social, and they respond to sex and treat it in a way not dissimilar to bonobos. So there are some arguments like that that are raised by Peach and also Dean at the start of the video, where they talk about, for example, penguins, and penguins will adopt other animals from other species to join their group. And keeping that in mind, these are positive examples, but there are also negative examples that we can utilize in ways useful to punching up against the state, such as parasitoid animals, the xenomorph, right, which is modeled chimerically after different animals, but notably the parasitoid wasp. And the example I give through metaphor, the comparing of humans to other animals, is the caterpillar and the wasp. All language is dualistic, which means that it's utilized by different actors for different purposes, generally workers versus the state in duality. And I utilize the caterpillar and the wasp dualistically to reverse abjection and develop communism inside capital by saying that, like the parasitoid wasp, that takes and injects an embryo into a caterpillar that is then consumed from within by the wasp larva eating the caterpillar and then emerging from the chrysalid to be accepted, if I understand it, and cared for by either not butterflies and caterpillars, which tend to produce in isolation. They don't have like hives, but other larvae that can be consumed in a similar manner. The parasitoid larva will be cared for by that species until it then leaves or hangs around said superorganism to then continue the process. So those kinds of metaphors, they don't have to be strictly positive or negative to be useful to developing communism, which can incorporate language of science in ways that are monstrous feminine, re Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, but also the Gorgon. So there are all of these examples of this sweet young boy here saying, oh, think of the bonobos, think of the penguins. And I'm like, no, think of the wasp, think of, ooh, scary, because those kinds of things, someone like the bad actor in this situation, this guy is already afraid of us and treating us like an enemy in bad faith. We can use that to our advantage in ways that castrate them, similar to the joke that Peach does at the end of the video. When you're dealing with bad actors, you can fuck with them in different ways while still educating your audience. And I think that Peach does a really good job, and I really like Dean as well. And the bad actor, Coley Stevens, is unfortunately kind of beyond repair at this point, certainly not beyond reproach, and can become the sport of fun where we hoist them on their own petard. In any event, I think I'm going to cut the video off there, but I hope that you found it useful as rich food for thought, where science is a tool, is a device, the fire of the gods, that can be used for good or for ill, depending. And those who serve the state will use it for ill. Those who serve workers, animals more broadly, and the environment, nature, can use it for good. And that's how I frame good versus ill in this situation. But I really enjoyed Peach's video. It's short, to the point. It has a lot of informative stuff. it raises a lot of really interesting points that I was just sort of grappling with and thinking about. Depending on what kind of junk you have, how might you think about what that means as an animal, as someone who has to engage in the risk taking that is sex? And I wanted to just give some poetic food for thought tied to a dialectical material critique that deals with bad actors all the time.